It's time for Joan Esposito on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
It is the third Wednesday of the month, and it is the time we set aside to speak with Spencer Critchley. Spencer, how are you?
I'm doing okay, Joan. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, I know you're a big music guy. So is my partner, Ray, and he is one of his three bands, as she said sarcastically, as a non-music person, is performing tonight in our neighborhood at a free concert. So I am actually looking forward to walking over there with the neighbors. And I've always told him that I want to be, that I want to be somebody who follows him because of my love for him. I want to be, and he's always like, no, I want you to be a roadie. I don't want to be a roadie. I don't want to be carrying equipment. I don't want to be dragging the amps to the car. How rude.
I might need to have a little talk with Ray.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're supposed to learn that early on, that's kind of a big mistake.
Yeah, I'm like, dude, seriously? That notwithstanding, and oh, by the way, I do refuse to touch the equipment. So, I've put my foot down, but yeah. I want to let the audience know, Spencer and I, we always talk about sort of big issue stuff. I want you to know that I'm going to open up the phone lines, 773-763-9278. You can text me on that line. You can call and have Devin put you through because of all the things that we've talked about. Today, we know we are going to be pushing buttons. You know, one of the things that I've mentioned on this show all the time is there are so many words that people throw around, and either they don't know what they mean or the meaning has become so cloudy, so muddy that you can sort of take the word and have it mean whatever you want it to mean in context. And one of those words is Zionism, and people who are consider themselves Zionist. We are going to talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. And, with everything going on right now in the Middle East, it seems like a very appropriate discussion to be having. So, Spencer, what is your definition of Zionism?
Well, the short version of Zionism is the belief that Jews need a homeland where they will be at home the way anybody would be, and in particular be safe. And that's usually seen as their ancestral homeland in the Middle East, which of course overlaps with the territory in which Palestinians live, and we see all of the resulting strife, certainly since the end of World War II and going back before that. And I think that while we're talking about Zionism, I really want to focus on anti-Zionism, the anti-Zionism that's become popular lately on the left, because I think that, at the core of the strife in the Middle East is just enormous complexity and enormous suffering amongst all of the people involved. And the trouble is that the current view of what's going on all too often is yet another example of human beings being addicted to binary thinking. It's really too hard for our brains most of the time to even begin to engage with the complexity of actual life. So we always want to reduce things to simple binary choices between yes and no and good and bad. And I'm very worried about the discussion about Zionism and anti-Zionism right now, where across much of the left, it's emerged as conventional wisdom that to be Zionist is bad and to be anti-Zionist is good.
Well, it has taken
the whole
on,
solution to the Middle East problem is to end Zionism.
Zionism, I think, has taken on these overtones of some kind of really, really radical stance. And, originally it didn't come from that kind of a place. My understanding is that, you want to create a state for the Jewish people and you support that, there you go. That's Zionism. It doesn't have anything to do with politics or who's elected or who's waging war against whom. That, my understanding, is just really, really basic. You believe that there is a movement that allows the creation of a Jewish state. But it's, to me, when I hear people using the word, you're right, whether they're on the left or not, people use it like a bad word.
Yeah, Zionist has become an insult,
Yes.
an all-purpose insult. You might be called a fascist, or you might be
Yes.
called a Zionist, or you might be called both. And that's really, you're basically right. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but basically, yeah, it is the belief that there is and should be a nation for the Jewish people, like there are nations that have been established for Germans and Italians and Japanese. America is kind of an exception because America is what's called a civic nation, founded on an idea. But almost every other nation started out as what's known as an ethnic nation. And so Israel is an example of that. Now, because of the history, it's more complicated than that. But to use the word Zionist as an insult is very much similar to using the word German, Italian, Japanese, or Brazilian as an insult.
How did this happen? How did this transition? Is it just because people who didn't really understand it used it as an insult?
Well, you know what I think would be helpful? That's part of it. But I think it would be helpful if I could, and if I don't blow past 3 commercial breaks in the process, try to give the shortest history I can of where Zionism came from and where the resistance to Zionism came from, at least in the Middle East, and then extending beyond there. Could I do that?
Well, you could, but you know what? We're at the beginning of the little section of time where I can take the break. So rather than interrupting you mid-thought, Devin, let's take our break now so we can chat in an uninterrupted fashion when we come right back after this.
This is Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Right before we went to break, I rudely interrupted Spencer Critchley. Well, that was good music, Devin. Thank you for that. I felt like getting up and dancing. I interrupted Spencer Critchley. We are talking about Zionism and what it means to be a Zionist and the derivation of the term, what it has come to mean, what it means for some people. Spencer, you now have the floor.
Okay. So I mentioned beforehand that my concern about binary thinking. And I said that what's happening across much of the left is this assumption that Zionist is a bad half of a binary and anti-Zionist is the good half of a binary. And my argument here is not to argue for or against any of the sides of this long conflict, but to argue for complexity. The reason this ongoing crisis and all of this ongoing terrible suffering has not just been resolved in some simple fashion is that it is just terribly complex and entangled, and it's very, very hard to solve. You can come up with what looks like a solution, but getting people to actually enact that solution is often close to impossible, if not actually always impossible. And one of the ways that it gets simplified to this, yes, no, black and white binary is this view that's become so popular in our universities, I'm afraid, based on the version of post-colonial theory that's taught there now, that sees Israel as a colonial oppressor and Hamas as a liberation movement. And I can see why people see it that way. It has certain surface features that remind people of the Algerian war against the French occupiers, for example, and other anti-colonial wars. But that, I will argue, is just a gross oversimplification of what's going on. And it's as much of an oversimplification as to say something like the only reason Palestinians are angry is because they hate Jews. Anybody who is at all familiar with the history would find that to be a really objectionable oversimplification of the Palestinian.
There's a lot of oversimplification when it comes to these kinds of discussions. And I'm seeing, frankly, some of that in the texting comments that have come in from people who clearly understand or believe they've understand that. Here's one. This is like the tamest one. Zionism is predicated on creating a Jewish ethno-state. Zionism relies on political violence and terrorism. That's one person covering all those bases.
Yeah, that's really common. I get a fair bit about this kind of thing lately as I've been talking about this topic, and it's one of the reasons why I'm talking about it. And as an extension of that, I'm not Jewish, but it's also because many Jews are afraid to talk about this topic these days because of the onslaught of that kind of talk they get immediately. Mm-hmm. And if we believe in equal rights for everybody, if we believe in equal rights for traditionally persecuted minorities, then the most important time to stand up for that belief is when some particular minority happens to be unpopular for whatever reason. It's easy to stand up for minorities who it's currently popular to stand up for. But right now, and I think this is a terrible situation, however you view the situation in the Middle East, including if you think Israel is by far overwhelmingly at fault for everything that's gone wrong. To have a situation where Jews are afraid to express their opinions is a terrible situation. It's just as terrible as if Muslims, Black people, women, anybody who's traditionally been silenced or oppressed is afraid to express their opinion. And we're in a situation like that across much of the left right now. So again, let me emphasize, I'm not arguing that one view of history is the correct one here. I'm arguing that there is no one correct view of history. It's enormously complicated. And if you refuse to consider all the different aspects of the history, you don't understand what's been happening, and you probably are not going to help work us towards some kind of solution. So with
even
that
if
said,
you look it up, the word up in Wikipedia, which I realize is not like the Oxford English Dictionary, the final sentence in the definition, Zionists wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine with as much land, as many Jews, and as few Palestinian Arabs as possible. So there you go.
That seems a little loaded. So what I promised to do before the break is to do my best to give a short history of Zionism. Now, I'm sure this history won't make anybody happy, whether they're Zionist, anti-Zionist, or somewhere in between, or just confused. But I'm going to do my best, okay? Mm-hmm. And it will be based on credible historical sources. So to describe Israel as an ethnic state, as one of these texters did, is, that's mostly accurate, although it's also a liberal democracy, unlike some other ethnic states. But almost every state, as I was saying earlier, was founded as an ethnic state. Germany is the home of the Germans, France of the Franks or the Gauls, Italy of the Italians, et cetera, et cetera. And so Israel was founded during actually the 19th century wave of nation-state formation, which, by the way, is a fairly recent phenomenon. Nations were only really invented starting in the late 18th and into the 19th century in the way we understand them now. And that's when modern Germany was founded and modern Italy was founded and lots of the nations we know now. So during that time, there was also a rise of Arab nationalism and the earliest form of Jewish nationalism or Zionism, which at first was very unpopular among most European Jews. It was a fringe movement, and Jews in Europe and in Russia were finally feeling optimistic after, a couple of millennia of oppression at the hands of various empires and nations and just groups of people who hated Jews. They were feeling somewhat optimistic because there was this liberalization happening as part of the Enlightenment that came up during the 18th century. So monarchies were liberalizing, including the monarchy of Tsar Alexander II in Russia. He was actually starting to give rights to Jews and protecting them from harassment and violence. And similar things were happening in Europe. Vienna, for example, was becoming a welcoming city to Jews, and it was in Vienna where there was this tremendous outpouring of Jewish creativity and success. You had people like Sigmund Freud and all these great composers and philosophers and scientists, and all clustered in Vienna. And so there was a great deal of optimism that finally things were going to get better for the Jews. And so when some folks were talking about, well, maybe with all these other people forming nations, it's time for the Jews to have their own nation. And the early Zionist movement started to grow up around that time. But in a really deep and dark irony of democratic progress, it turned out that when you didn't just have an absolute ruler like Alexander II decreeing that Jews now would be entitled to some rights, but you started to have more democratic societies. As the common people started to have more democratic power, there was this resurgence of what we could call grassroots anti-Semitism that had been there for, around 2,000 years. And so after Alexander II was assassinated, the next guy was an arch conservative and not at all friendly to the Jews. And then you started to have all these terrible pogroms against the Jews in Russia. Meanwhile, in France, there was the Dreyfus affair where a Jewish army officer was wrongly convicted of being a traitor. And this stretched on for a couple of decades, but was an enormous scandal in France and really an epochal event in the history of anti-Semitism. And then after World War I, there was further backsliding in terms of equal rights for Jews and a continuing resurgence of this really virulent anti-Semitism that was getting worse and worse. And of course, in the 1930s, we saw the rise of the Nazis. And then in World War II, we had the Holocaust. So Zionism amongst Jews went from being this fringe movement that most Jews didn't take seriously, and there were many Jewish anti-Zionists. They thought, well, this is going to just screw everything up. We're finally starting to be accepted as of the late 19th century. Things are finally going our way, and you want to separate us from everybody? We should, no, we should merge with European or Russian society and enjoy the fruits of this. And, the educated Jews tended to be in favor of the Enlightenment, in favor of liberal democracy, so they liked the way that was going. But then the way history ended up working out with this resurgence of increasingly vicious anti-Semitism, Europe and Russia and Europe gradually shut down for the Jews so that they were increasingly seeing their rights taken away from them. They were targeted by violence. And then with the Nazis and their explicitly anti-Semitic and then increasingly genocidal message. And then in World War II, we saw them act on it, and we saw the Holocaust to the point that the population of Europe was almost entirely depleted of Jews. And so by that time, Zionism had gone from being this fringe movement dismissed by most Jews or actively opposed by them to embraced by almost all Jews, because now the remaining Jews were a population of desperate refugees who, by the way, had also been turned away largely by the United States and Canada and other countries that, I think we should be ashamed to be able to say that about.
Yeah,
so they were in this
shame.
position of desperate refugees, although I should say, in all fairness, the United States have been quite welcoming to the Jews for a while. It's just that went away. Anyway, you had this population after the Holocaust of desperate refugees who had narrowly survived extinction, who now saw the ancient land of Israel, where, from their point of view, there had been a continuous presence of Jews for 3,000 years. They saw that as their last hope. So it was basically Zionism or nothing. And that's the version of Zionism that, as it looks to most Jews, for understandable reasons. So this post-colonial theory version of Zionism is that Zionists are basically the same as European colonizers like Britain or France or Belgium or Germany and the other European countries that colonized indigenous peoples around the world and exploited them and oppressed them and often enacted violence against them while stealing their land and overriding their culture and all of the terrible things that happened as a result of colonialism. Now, you can criticize a lot about the founding of Israel, but to call this population of desperate refugees, the few survivors of the slaughter of millions of people just like them, to the point that Europe had been basically depopulated of Jews, to call them European colonizers who are going in to become oppressors of indigenous people, when they themselves are also indigenous people from the same land. The roots are the same. The Arabs have been present in that same land for roughly 2,500 years, I believe. I don't think it matters who's been there a few hundred years longer, one way or the other. But you can see why I think that's just a radical oversimplification of the situation we're dealing with here. And there's much more to it than that. You know, once we get into the founding of Israel, not by a wave of European colonizers coming in and conquering this land, but by the United Nations after Britain had basically handed the problem over to the United Nations.
I do want to get into all of that. We need to take another break, though I do want to share with you, you got at least one wonderful text. I agree with Spencer. Equal rights for all needs to be the baseline we use in our judgments, decisions, and policies. It is a simple plan. Thanks, from Rick. We're going to take a break. Spencer and I will be back with more talk that's going to make you crazy right after this.
Joan Esposito, live,
Celebrating our power to bring about change.
local,
Everybody has to work together.
and progressive.
I think you get the idea.
On WCPT 820.
Spencer Critchley is here, and we have decided to tackle the subject of Zionism, a word that is bandied about quite a bit. And my frustration is that it seems that each person who uses the word comes away with a different understanding of what it is they're talking about, what that word means. Spencer, we've gotten a couple of texts that talk about, getting rid of Netanyahu, and that's something that you and I have talked about before, that the government isn't the state.
I would love to see that.
Yeah, and vice versa.
I would love to see that happen.
But here's one text that came in. Zionism is the belief that Palestinians can and must be expelled from their homeland so that settlers can take their place. You're saying a lot of words when the last sentence in that Wikipedia post summed up the history of Zionism much better than you ever could. It is a racist ethno-state turned terroristic.
Yeah. So this is typical of, the discussion of this topic. And any time someone insists that the answer is easy, it's this, it's because Palestinians are evil, or it's because Israel is a terrorist ethno-state, bunch of settler colonialists, etc. Anything that's formulated that way is likely, almost certainly, to be wrong. If you're talking about history, especially a history as tortured as this one. The 20th century columnist known as the Sage of Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, about whom, there's problems we could point to as well, but he's often quoted because he's so quotable. He famously said, for every complicated solution, there's an answer that's simple and wrong. And that's true of this history. So, as an example of that, I was just talking about, the history of Zionism, the way it would be described as part of Jewish history. And I don't want to skate over the problems with the foundation of the creation of Israel. It's just that the creation of the state of Israel was much more complicated than this really radically simplistic settler colonialist view that unfortunately is being taught in so many of our universities, and which, in my opinion, is reductive to the point of frequently just being plain ahistorical. So I'll try to be really brief about this part as well. So, after World War II, colonialism was falling apart, and Britain, which had been the most powerful imperial empire in the world, was broke after World War II and couldn't afford to keep its colonies even if it wanted to. And it had inherited what we now call, modern Israel or Palestine after World War I, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had previously been occupying all of that area for a long time, often fairly tolerantly, by the way. But so Britain inherited it after World War I, and the mission there was to try to manage the transition to a Jewish homeland that would also would be shared by the Arabs who were already living there. And by the way, there were Jews already living there, as there had been for thousands of years. But clearly the majority was Arabs. So that was difficult from the start. And after World War II, Britain was broke and exhausted and basically handed the problem over to the United Nations. And that invited participation by Arab nations and Jewish leaders, and also, other United Nations members like the United States and European powers, et cetera, to try to work out a essentially two-state solution that would be fair to Arabs and to Jews and find a way to share this land that both Arabs and Jews had been claiming for thousands of years, a conflict, a disagreement over whose homeland that was that goes back literally thousands of years. The Arab nations refused to participate in that process. Israel did, and at the end, there was a large majority vote in the United Nations to create the modern state of Israel as shared land, roughly split between Arabs and Jews, although Jews got some percentage points more in terms of square miles than Arabs did. That led to war. There was the Arab nations were. The Arab nations refused to recognize the state of Israel. Israel declared independence, and then we had war with Arab nations attacking this new Israeli state because they saw it as a foreign presence in their midst. Now, ever since, there have been atrocities committed by both sides, and you can argue forever over who's been worse. I think that one fundamental argument for Israel is that it's at least founded as a liberal democracy, and it's been battling dictatorships for most of its existence. But that said, nothing justifies atrocities, in my view. So during what the Israelis call the War of Independence and what Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, which started in 1948, there were atrocities such as Deir Yassin in April of 1948, when these paramilitary groups, Israeli paramilitary groups, killed roughly 100 Palestinian villagers, including women and children. Israelis did expel tens of thousands of Palestinians during the course of this war. There are other atrocities, and and anybody can Google this stuff. If you Google something like, atrocities committed by Israelis during their War of Independence, you'll come up with stuff like this. But if you're also willing to Google things like atrocities committed by the Palestinian resistance over the years, you can come up with truly horrifying stories about that as well. And again, to say that the whole problem here is that that Israelis were essentially in the tradition of European colonization of indigenous peoples requires you to ignore all the other history. Just like if you were to argue that Israel is 100% righteous in all of this and anything to the contrary is just anti-Semitic propaganda, that requires you to ignore a whole bunch of history. Nobody emerges from this history with clean hands, and obviously the way Israel was created did not work out all that well. If you look at what's happened since, whoever you want to say is at fault, and I would argue that many, many people are at fault, and ultimately human nature is at fault. But this current binary that if we just got rid of Zionism, which means if we got rid of the state of Israel, then we wouldn't have this problem, it's typical of this post-colonial theory that's being taught, which is part of this overall brand of theory I've talked to you about before that I have big problems with for similar reasons, that it's just so radically reductive and ultimately shares the same kind of radical reductivism that is why Marxism doesn't work, or any form of, extreme ideological dogmatism.
We have been getting texts from people. Have Spencer talk about this. Have Spencer about this. Ask Spencer about this. So let's start with one of our regulars, Carl from Kankakee. Wants you to discuss a history of addressing compensation for those displaced by the Zionist settlers?
Yeah, well, I mean, how much time do we have? This is also typical of this
Spencer
of this
will be
kind of
back every day this week at 4 o'clock as we continue on this journey.
Joan, I hate to say it, but with this rigidity and reductivism that's becoming so common on the left, as you know, I spend a lot of time talking to people on the right, and it's like the mirror image. So this is an example of somebody say, oh, yeah, well, what about this particular example, which will then lead us, down a rabbit hole. And then the next person has their own rabbit hole. And pretty soon you've got this infinitely branching conversation. And at no point have we addressed any of the points we started out with. And so, as I've said repeatedly here, my point here is not to argue that Israel's never done anything wrong, far from it. And similarly, my point is not to argue that Palestinians or God knows the people leading Palestinians have never done anything wrong, because I think a big part of this problem is that the Palestinian people have been led by a series of crooks and terrorists and dictators who did not have their interests at heart. And now the Israelis are suffering under the leadership of Netanyahu, who I think is doing an enormous amount of damage to the state of Israel.
Spencer, why don't we take a break here? And because we're on our final segment, let's talk about Netanyahu and the current government of Israel. Spencer Critchley and I will be right back after this. Hey, are you interested in buying a home? Call Team Hochberg, our trusted local lender. They have nearly 800 five-star Google reviews. Tom and Jenny have 2 kids. They'd outgrown their small apartment. They had 640 credit scores, a combined income of $130,000, limited savings. They called Team Hochberg for a free consultation. David answered their questions, introduced them to a realtor who then found them the perfect home, and he helped them secure an FHA mortgage with just 3.5% down. Before calling Team Hochberg, Tom and Jenny felt stuck in an apartment that no longer fit their growing family. After talking with David, they got an FHA mortgage and bought their first home with only 3.5% down. If you're looking for a home, you have credit scores in the 600s, limited funds for a down payment, do what many of our listeners have done, like Tom and Jenny. Call Team Hochberg, 855-563-2843, or go online, 56david.com. That number again, 855-563-2843, or go on the website you know and love, 56david.com. ACM Equal Housing Lender, NMLS 643114.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive.
I wouldn't trust anybody else.
On WCPT 820.
Spencer Critchley and I, but mostly Spencer, have been talking for the last hour about Zionism and how the right of Israel to exist does not mean a rubber stamp for the government of Israel. Those are 2 separate things. And I've been getting a number of texts about Benjamin Netanyahu. You and I have talked about this before, Spencer, that one thing is not the other thing.
Right. And, Netanyahu and Hamas in many ways kind of need each other. And they perpetuate this problem by serving their own self-interest. And meanwhile, it's the people who suffer on both sides. I want to say something about Hamas as well. Megan Romer, one of the co-chairs, I think, of the DSA, and expressing opinions that are common with the DSA these days in its present form. It's changed a lot in the last few years. Was defending the October 8th, pro-Hamas rally that happened after October 7th, after the terrible massacre of Israeli civilians on October 7th. And she was defending that and saying it was inevitable because of this settler colonialist view of the situation there. And this is typical of seeing Hamas as a liberation movement. First of all, it's not necessary for liberation movements to target civilians deliberately, and the successful ones don't do that. The ones that do that end up just either failing or creating a new form of dictatorship. Hamas is not a liberation movement. They are a brutal dictatorship oppressing the people in Gaza. They are deliberately sacrificing Palestinian civilians as part of their strategy because they want to see essentially the thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of deaths of Palestinian civilians. This does not excuse the IDF for those civilian deaths, but that plays right into Hamas's strategy. Hamas will not let Palestinian civilians into those tunnels where Hamas fighters are safe from bombs raining down. They've never used those as bomb shelters. And if Hamas were to somehow defeat Israel and establish stable rule over the same territory where Israel is now, however much those folks living there, however much they might object to Israel, they would be living under something far, far worse. That's, again, not a justification of the occupation, but they would be living under a corrupt, brutally cruel, theocratic dictatorship that has no interest in Western concepts like rights or even the concept of a nation. Their mission ultimately is to redeem Islam and take it back essentially to the way it was in the 7th century when it was founded by the Prophet Muhammad. So that's another part of this that's just it kind of boggles my mind. But this stuff is actually being taught and has been taught to generations of college students as just, well, this is the current state of historical scholarship.
You know, it's really frustrating because we want this to be simple and we want this to be easy. We got this text that I thought you'd appreciate. Please tell Spencer that April in Oak Park deeply appreciates his explaining the complexity of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. I'm so disappointed that our beloved left has become so rigid about this issue. And that's not just the left. There are a lot of people who have become very rigid about this issue across the political spectrum, too.
I wholeheartedly agree, though, because supposedly at least the liberal left, which is everybody from the center to the far progressive left of liberalism, one of our core principles, there's nothing more fundamental than the principle of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. You know, there are other equally important principles, but they're none more important than that. And to have a situation where on the left, large numbers of people are afraid to express their opinions, this does not mean anybody has to agree with any of those opinions. But the idea that expressing an opinion, unless, of course, it's some kind of hateful violence inciting opinion, then of course we should criticize that. But the whole point is that we're supposed to be the people in favor of freedom and equality for everybody. But it turns out if you're an unpopular minority, you don't get it. And how could that possibly be something we want to have said about people on the left? I also wholeheartedly agree with the point that what needs to be defended here is complexity. As I have said multiple times, I'm not arguing for one side or the other here. I am arguing for recognizing the terrible complexity of this issue and the complexity that's typical of pretty much every important issue.
I'm going to read you one complimentary text about that and then throw you another text that wants to have a point of view on this. Joan, good job trying to tackle this so polarizing subject. Thanks to you and Spencer both to try and bring reason back to this important problem. It's a problem that may damage our chances in the upcoming election. And then there's this. Liberals love to blame Netanyahu when most Israelis don't feel he's gone far enough in exterminating Palestinians. It's liberals' way of denouncing a genocide while still funding it. That one goes on, but I think we've captured it.
Two things here. That's a classic straw man argument where you start out by saying that's something that sounds like it's terrible. And of course, we must be against that. The trouble is, it's just not true. So, you know, it's essentially the same as, have you finally stopped beating your wife? It's a straw man argument to say that's the whole point. And I forget what the second half of that one was. Liberals.
Blaming Netanyahu is a liberal's way of denouncing a genocide while still funding it.
So here this is something that liberals writ large don't fully appreciate that liberalism has become a dirty word across much of the left as well. And this, again, also largely proceeds from the academic left, which I think has a lot to answer for. Partly because I disagree with their opinions, but that's not by far the most important thing. I would say partly because their scholarship is so shockingly shoddy, as you'll learn if you actually learn about it. And I'm far from alone among people on the left who have that opinion. And so it's become conventional wisdom that liberals, are essentially the same as just collaborators with oppression. And liberalism is at best a sham, if not part of this whole structure of oppression that's keeping the people down. This is another opinion that dates back to Karl Marx. And unfortunately, most liberals in America anyway are not particularly ideological, and they don't realize that liberalism is under assault. And I argue, if you think you're a liberal, you need to understand what that means and why you're a liberal. You need to understand some basics about what you stand for. Because if you think you can be in an alliance with people who are anti-liberal, that's not going to work. You can't be liberal and anti-liberal at the same time. You can be centrist liberal and very progressively liberal at the same time. But you can't be both for and against liberalism at the same time. And in my view, again, it's not the only view in the world, and I welcome people disagreeing with it because I'm a liberal. But in my view, liberalism is the only successful response to tyranny that history has yet produced. And if we want to just throw away this precious inheritance, it's not perfect, it's certainly got lots of flaws, but if we want to throw it away, what we're choosing is tyranny. And whether it's tyranny on the right, as we see on the MAGA right, or I would argue tyranny on the left, which is what we see in the worst of the most intolerant and dogmatic parts of the anti-liberal left.
You know what? We are very close to the end of our segment, so I'm not even going to read you any more texts.
I can probably imagine what they say.
Well, they're really, honestly, there have been a ton of them. I mean, a ton of them, and they're kind of all over the map. There isn't, it's very interesting to me when I'm talking about something and most of the texters have a particular point to make and they make it over and over and over again. But on this particular subject, man, we have had responses that go from A to Z, and very few of them have repeated the ideas presented in other people's texts, which is very unusual for this show, which just goes to show how my original thesis was that this isn't something we can even all agree on a definition about, let alone
there are definitions. It's just that people keep stating new ones, like Zionism is inherently, terrorist and settler colonialist, etc. One of the most important things I hope we can someday soon recover is the ability to hear a point made by another person and then address that point, instead of just reasserting our own opinion as if the other person didn't say anything. And in addressing the point, if you don't understand why they believe that, maybe ask them why they believe that. If you think you have a completely different understanding, maybe frame that as, gosh, my understanding of that was this. Why don't you see it that way? Imagine the potential, folks.
Yeah, really.
Imagine the possibilities. I say, dare to learn something. I know we're running out of time, but another way I often talk about this is, look, if I want to make sure I never, ever lose an argument, I know how to do that. And that's by being willing to lose an argument. Because if I lose, let's say that I learn after this show, somebody writes me a thoughtful note and they point out how I got everything wrong and they cite some credible sources I can look up and check for myself. And I learn a lot in that case, I say, oh my God, I think I had this all wrong. Well, okay, so I lost a big argument, but I didn't really lose because now I know a lot more, right? I'm less ignorant.
Exactly.
Right? that's a win for me. It's as if by losing the argument, if I lose an argument with you and you hand me $1,000, I don't feel too bad about that, right? But imagine all the hours I might have spent, or even years of my life I might have spent being wrong about some topic, and somebody who defeats me in an argument points out where I was wrong. I win. So in that way, you never
win
ever
either
lose
way.
an argument.
By the way, one of our last texters wants us to now take on the words liberal and progressive. Sweetheart, that'll be another day, another time.
That's a great idea.
Because we're out of time. And Spencer, thank you so much. It's most of the people who've texted in that appreciate this discussion realize, that we are really putting ourselves on the line with a very controversial kind of topic. And I thank you for being willing to go there.
Oh, I thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And as usual, the great questions and great conversation.